The laughter started before Mrs. Stowell finished reading the letter. Not the polite kind, not the restrained kind that girls in institutional settings learn to produce when authority is watching. This was full and ugly and genuine, the sound of 19 people releasing something they'd been holding for a long time. It rolled through the common room of the Platte River Girls' Home, the way wind rolls across open Nebraska grassland, finding no obstacle, losing nothing in the crossing. Clara Mae Whitfield stood in the middle of it. She was 16 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of near invisible thinness, in a dress 2 sizes too large that had belonged to a girl who left the previous spring under circumstances nobody discussed. Her hair was dark, almost black, where it caught no light, and her eyes were the particular shade of gray that looked silver in winter sunlight and nearly colorless in the flat institutional glow of a room like this one. Her hands were small. That was the detail people noticed and promptly forgot. Small hands that didn't match the economy of motion she'd developed over years of making herself useful in other people's spaces, hands that moved with a carpenter's precision, even when they had nothing to build. She didn't look at the girls laughing behind her. She looked at Mrs. Edna Stowell. The matron of the Platte River Girls' Home was a woman who had developed her face into a tool over 4 decades of institutional authority. It could express mild disgust without effort, the expression she wore most often. It could arrange itself into what passed for sympathy during inspections by county officials. It could close entirely like a door being shut when questions were asked that she found inconvenient. Now it was doing something Clara Mae had never seen it do before. It was enjoying itself, Mrs. Stowell folded the letter along its existing creases with the care of someone returning a borrowed object, in better condition than received, looked directly at Clara Mae, and her voice carried the particular satisfaction of a woman who has waited a long time to deliver a verdict. Well, your people have left you a windbreak without the break. I suppose even the dead can play a joke. The laughter peaked. Clara Mae stood inside it and looked at the letter in Mrs. Stowell's hands and did something that would only make sense to her later years, later standing in a different kind of cold with a lantern in her fist. She heard the number, 160 acres, 160, and between the main structure and the outbuilding 50 feet. Not a mile, not a quarter mile, 50 feet, which was nothing, which was a few seconds of walking, which was a distance so small it barely qualified as a distance at all. Her mind didn't hear danger first. It heard a measurement, and anything that could be measured could be understood. That was the thought she would carry out of that room, out of that building, out into the thin October air of Kearney County, Nebraska, where nobody was laughing, and the sky went on in every direction without stopping. The property was called Half Sky Draw. The letter from the attorney's office in Hastings described it as a 160-acre homestead claim in the Nebraska Sandhills, 12 miles from the nearest town, with existing structures including a primary dwelling and a secondary outbuilding. The men in Forked Wells, Clara Mae would later learn, had their own name for it. They called it the 50-foot grave, and they'd been calling it that for years, since before Harriet Crane bought it for $18, and a filing fee which told you everything necessary about what the land was worth to anyone except the woman who was willing to live on it. Clara Mae had never heard of Harriet Crane before the letter arrived. This is the first thing to understand about the morning the laughter happened. She stood in that room knowing nothing about the woman who had left her this land, knowing only that she had inherited something, and that the room full of people who had watched her fail to belong anywhere for the better part of a decade found it spectacularly funny. Her mother had died of childbed fever when Clara Mae was 7. Her father, a railroad section hand who kept neither jobs nor bottles capped for long, walked into a winter storm 2 years after that and didn't walk back. They found him frozen against a fence post 3 miles from the rail camp. The railroad didn't pay for the burial. After that, Clara Mae had belonged to whoever would take her. 8 months with Aunt Rilla, who needed help with washing, but not another mouth at the table. 1 year with the Bostwick family, who let her sleep near the stove and sent her away when Mrs. Bostwick had her own baby and the arithmetic of mouths changed. 9 months at the Platte River Girls' Home, the first time where she learned to sew and to keep her eyes down and to take from the discard pile rather than ask. 3 months with the Kurtz family, who collected the state money for her keep and told her that books made girls ungrateful, by which they meant girls who read things started asking questions that households like theirs didn't want asked. Back to the home at 15, where Mrs. Stowell made it quietly clear that Clara Mae had used up whatever patience the institution kept in reserve for difficult cases. She had $4, a tin cup, a winter coat worn through at both elbows, and a valise packed with books she'd taken quietly from the home's discard pile over 2 years of careful, patient collection. Seed catalogs, farm bulletins, weather pamphlets from the Department of Agriculture, anything with diagrams, with measurements, with tables of data that the other girls found too dull to bother stealing. Clara May had read every one of them twice and could recite the average frost dates for central Nebraska by county. She left the home 3 days after the letter arrived. Mrs. Stowell did not try to stop her. Clara May understood from the quality of the woman's absence at the door that she was being let go with something adjacent to relief. One fewer girl who read too much and asked the wrong questions filed out of the ledger. Nobody came to see her off. The morning was cold and clear, and the prairie grass along the road to town was the color of old straw. The wagon driver was a man named Walt Krebs, who hauled freight between the rail stop and the settlements further west. He charged her $1.50 for the ride, which left her $2.50 to begin a life with. He was a man of minimal conversation, which suited her entirely. She sat on a crate of assorted nails and watched Nebraska change around her in a way that felt less like traveling and more like watching categories dissolve. The first hour had trees, cottonwoods along the creek beds, a few farmsteads with windbreaks planted on the northwest exposure, where experience had taught people which direction trouble came from. Then the trees got smaller. Then they got farther apart. Then they stopped. The road, which had been packed dirt with opinions about where it was going, became sand ruts that the wagon lurched through sideways, and Krebs navigated by something that looked like memory more than sight. The grass went on in every direction without pause or explanation, pressed flat by wind that had apparently never been told it needed to stop somewhere. Krebs pointed with his whip handle when they reached the lane. He didn't get down to help with her valise. His only offering was half-mile that way. Good luck with it. Then he turned the wagon and took the freight and himself back toward the town with walls and a roof, and Clara May stood alone in grass that came up past her knees with the wind at her back, and 12 miles of bad road behind her, and half a mile of lane ahead. She walked it. The wind pushed her north the whole way, which she would remember later as the landscape trying to help her arrive. The shack came into view first. Gray boards weathered past the point where the original wood color was a matter of guessing. A roof that had developed opinions about which direction it preferred to hang, and those opinions ran toward the middle of the structure. One window with a piece of burlap nailed over a crack in the glass that had been there long enough to have faded to the same gray as the boards around it. And beyond the shack, separated by a distance that looked from here like nothing at all, stood the barn. Low structure, patched roof door hanging off true on its hinges, 50 feet between them. Clara May stood at the end of the lane and looked at the distance and thought about the number. In the October sun, with the grass golden and the sky the particular blue that the Great Plains produces in the hour before afternoon, tips into evening, 50 feet was a walk. It was less than a minute. It was the kind of space you crossed without deciding to the way you cross a room in your own home. She did not understand yet what that space became when the wind turned from weather into weapon and the snow arrived horizontal and the world contracted to a white radius of 3 feet in every direction. That understanding would come. Everything about this place would have to come the same way, earned rather than granted, measured rather than assumed. The inside of the shack smelled of mouse activity and old lamp black and a particular staleness that happens when a space has held one person's life for a very long time and that life has ended. The door screamed on its hinges when she pushed it open, not from disrepair alone, but from the specific protest of a door that had been opened a certain way by the same hands for 30 years and now was being opened differently. Inside, one cot frame with a mattress that had experienced too much. One shelf with 3 cracked mason jars containing nothing. A stove that had been drawing poorly for years, which she could determine from the soot patterns on the ceiling above it, dark arcs that tracked the smoke's long argument with the flue. A single nail in the wall, and from that nail, still hanging an apron. Someone had stuffed rags into the gaps between the boards where the wind had found entry points. Not recently. The rags had been there long enough to have compressed and shifted, and in some places fallen out again, and new gaps had opened beside the old repairs, and the wind found those too. Clara May could hear it. not as a sound outside the structure separate and distant, as a presence inside the walls, testing, looking patient in the way that things without consciousness can still seem patient. She set her valise on the commode and stood in the middle of the single room and breathed. The cold was different here than in town. In town, cold was weather. Here it felt like a condition of the landscape, something that had been here before the shack was built and would be here after the shack was gone, something the structure merely interrupted without actually defeating. She had $2.50, no matches yet, no lamp oil, no food beyond the end of a loaf of bread she'd wrapped in her extra shirt. The stove was cold and the afternoon light was going, and the mice in the walls were conducting their evening business with no particular concern about her presence. She was 16 years old and she was entirely alone, and the nearest town was 12 miles away by bad road, and there was not one person in any direction who expected her to succeed at this. She knew that clearly enough that it didn't need to be stated even to herself. The knowledge sat in her chest not as despair, but as data, one more measurable fact about her situation that she could work with or against, same as the frost dates in the pamphlets, same as the distance between the buildings. 50 feet. The number was still with her as she ate the last of the bread in the cold and lay down on the cot in all the clothes she owned and listened to the shack breathe. She didn't sleep well. That first night she kept returning to Mrs. Stowell's face, the way the woman's expression had organized itself into something that looked like amusement, and maybe was, in the way the laughter had moved through the room. There was a specific quality to being laughed at by a room full of people who know you well enough to have opinions about you. It's different from being mocked by strangers. It has texture. Clara May lay in the dark and felt the texture of it and decided without drama and without a particular speech to herself about it that she was not going back. The barn was worse than the shack structurally. She walked the 50 feet in the afternoon light of her second day and noted that the walk, still meaning nothing in October sun, took her precisely long enough to count 17 seconds at a normal pace. She counted. She always counted, catalogs sorted into categories of data. Inside the barn, 3 stalls for cattle. She didn't own a hayloft with half its boards missing the smell of old manure and rotted straw. That was not unpleasant exactly, but was old in a way that felt like history rather than neglect. The roof leaked in 2 places she could identify, and certainly more she couldn't. The well stood between the 2 buildings, and when she dropped a pebble into it, she heard it tick against a skin of ice thin enough to break and thick enough to announce winter's intentions. The stove's problem was the flue, which she cleaned with a wire brush she found hanging on a nail in the barn, and that first fire she managed was a negotiation rather than a victory, smoke filling the room until she opened the door and let the cold in to argue with the heat, and eventually the draw improved and the smoke went where it was supposed to go. She ate beans she'd brought in her coat pocket, cooked in the tin cup over the improved fire, and read by lamplight when she had matches, rationing the oil because she didn't know yet when she'd be able to afford more. On the morning of the 3rd day, she was looking for anything useful, any previous inhabitant's overlooked resource, when she pushed the cot aside and found it. The grain chest was oak, well constructed, with brass hinges gone green with age, and careful joinery at the corners that spoke of someone who had understood that the things you built to last had to be built to deserve lasting. She dragged it from under the quin and opened the lid. Inside, a brass barometer with a cracked face, the needle still moving in small, deliberate arcs. A bundle of cedar stakes cut to different lengths with notches marked at measured intervals. And a sketch on brown paper that had been folded and unfolded enough times that the fold lines were nearly as dark as the pencil marks. The sketch showed 2 structures connected by a lane with parallel lines running between them and numbers written in careful faded script. 48 feet, 6 feet wide, 8 feet high. She didn't understand what she was looking at. Not yet. But she noticed that the chest was shallower on the inside than its exterior dimensions suggested it should be, and when she set the barometer and the stakes aside and pressed her palm flat against the bottom of the chest, she felt a slight give of wood over hollow space. The kitchen knife worked well enough as a pry tool. She lifted the false bottom, which was not nailed, but fitted with precision into a channel routed into the interior walls, the kind of concealment that wanted to be found by the right person and missed by the wrong one. Underneath it, 11 ledgers, each one wrapped in flour sacking and tied with twine, each one labeled in the same careful hand. Wind, snow, calving, roof failures, passages, losses, warm corners. January notes, storm signs, barn heat, and the last one thicker than the others, it's flour sacking tied with a double knot for whoever comes. Clara May sat down on the floor. The cold came up through the boards and into her legs. She didn't notice. She took the last ledger first because she couldn't do otherwise, because it was addressed to her or to whoever she was among the possible people who might stand where she was standing. The flour sacking was stiff with age, and the twine took patience to unknot. When she opened the cover, she found two things inside. The first was a handwritten entry dated March 1881, in ink so faded it had gone from black to brown and was working toward invisibility. I have bought a quarter section that everyone calls worthless. The men in Forked Wells say I am building a grave for myself. Perhaps I am, but I have spent my life watching wind, and I believe there are things about this country that nobody has thought to measure. The second was a folded slip of paper tucked between the cover and the first page, smaller than the ledger, and written in a different hand. The same handwriting she would come to understand, but from years later, when the hand had developed its own argument with arthritis and each letter required intention. She unfolded it. Clara May Whitfield, Platte River Girls Home, Kearney County. Daughter of my niece Ruth. If you find this, it means you came. I hoped you would. I wrote to the matron twice. The minister Whitaker passed through both Forked Wells and your home. In his circuit year, he is the one who told me about you, a girl named Clara May, from Ruth's line, who reads everything she can find and has no family to speak of. I asked him to describe you, and he said she measures things with her eyes before she touches them. I knew then, come find me if I am here. Come find my notebooks if I am not. Declara. May read the note 4 times. Her mother Ruth had been a Crane by her mother's side, a connection thin enough and old enough that nobody had thought to mention it in any of the places Clara May had been passed through. Harriet Crane was her great aunt, her grandmother's sister, the woman who had bought this land for $18 and been called crazy for 30 years. And Harriet had known about her, had tried to reach her, had written to Mrs. Stowell at the Platte River Girls' Home not once but twice asking for a girl who read things and measured the world with her eyes, and Mrs. Stowell had Clara May set the note very carefully on top of the false bottom of the chest. She pressed her palm flat against it for a moment, as though pressing it into something permanent. Then she opened the ledger to the second page and began to read. Harriet Crane had measured everything. This is the only way to say it that captures the scope of what filled those 11 ledgers. She had measured wind direction by month and by storm type. She had measured snow depth at 23 different points on the property and tracked which spots drifted first and which held clear, and how those patterns changed from year to year, and how they remained consistent in ways that could be predicted if you had enough years of data. She had measured temperature differences between the north and south walls of the shack, between the interior and exterior of the barn, between open ground and the sheltered side of hay bale stacks, between morning and noon, and the hour after sunset. The numbers went on for pages and pages, written small and without apology. Not poetry, not philosophy. Data. January 12, 1883. Northwest wind. Temperature at dawn, -8. Temperature behind bale stack, +4. Difference of 12 degrees. The straw does not stop cold. It stops wind. Arson. Wind is what kills. Clara May read that entry and went still in the way she went still when something reorganized her understanding of a thing. She read it again. The straw does not stop cold. It stops wind. Wind is what kills, not insulation, break, not warmth, stillness. She kept reading. The morning light came through the burlap-covered window and changed from gray to white to the thin gold of a November prairie morning, and the fire burned down without her noticing, and her fingers went numb, turning pages, and she didn't stop. March 2nd, 1891. 2 bale walls and canvas roof over the door. Lantern held steady in passage. No flicker. Wind running over, not through. Harriet had been building things. Not permanent structures, not lumber and nails, and the kind of construction that required money she didn't have, but temporary structures that she rebuilt each autumn and let soften and settle each spring. Windbreak walls. Sheltered corners for calving where the temperature stayed above freezing when the open barn floor wouldn't. and a short covered passage between her kitchen door and the well that she called the drink walk, because the well was 20 feet from the door, and 20 feet in January could be its own kind of danger. The passage work is what matters most. Everything else is preparation for being able to move between points. A body cannot feed the cattle it cannot reach. A body cannot haul the water it cannot walk to. The killing distance on this land is not miles. It is feet. It is the 50 feet between my door and my barn door. Clara May stopped reading. She looked up at the wall of the shack at the rags stuffed into the gaps at the nail with the apron on it that she had not moved because it seemed like the kind of thing you left where someone had put it. She thought about 17 seconds at a normal walking pace. She thought about what 17 seconds became when you couldn't see your hand in front of your face and the wind was moving at 40 miles an hour and the temperature had dropped to 30 below. She went back to the ledger. She found the entry she had been afraid to find. January 8th, 1895. Lost yearling heifer in drift between house and barn. Distance only 50 feet. Distance is not the measure. Exposure is. Found her on my hands and knees. She had stopped 10 feet from the barn door. 10 feet. She froze standing up and then fell over. The heifer had made it 40 feet. She had stopped 10 feet short of shelter. 10 feet. Clara May set the ledger down on her knees and looked at the false bottom of the chest and the note with her name on it, and thought about a woman she had never met who had measured wind for 30 years on a piece of land everyone agreed was worthless and had been called crazy for every one of those 30 years and had kept going. Not because she knew it would work, but because she was not finished measuring. Harriet Crane had looked at the same problem Clara May was now looking at, the same 50 feet, the same winter that turned a short walk into a sentence, and had refused to accept it. Someone had been here before. Someone had seen exactly this and refused to call it impossible. Clara May was not starting from nothing. She was continuing something. The first winter nearly killed her, and she would say that afterward without dramatic emphasis as a statement of straightforward biological fact. By December, she had lost 15 pounds she hadn't had to spare. Her dresses hung from her shoulders with the silhouette of something unfinished. Her hands cracked and bled from hauling water and splitting what little wood she could find, scrap lumber from the barn's deteriorating interior, and dead branches from a creek bed 3 miles away that she made the trip to twice a week on foot because she had no horse and no money for one. The stove drew better after she cleaned the flue, but it ate wood faster than she could gather it. The wind found the wall gaps despite the rags she pushed in and replaced and pushed in again. She woke each morning with frost on the inside of the window glass and her breath visible in the air of the room, and she dressed in everything she owned, and she went out and she did the necessary things. The well froze solid in January. Not the surface, the whole thing top to bottom, a column of ice that her efforts with a pickaxe could not address. For 3 weeks she melted snow in the biggest pot she had standing over the stove, with the pot filling it, watching it melt down to a third of its volume, filling it again, rationing the water output against the wood input, doing the arithmetic with the same automatic part of her brain that counted seconds on the 50-foot walk. She needed this much water per day. She could melt this much snow per quart of wood. She had this much wood left. She ate beans, stale bread until it ran out, and then not bread. Twice she caught rabbits in a trap she constructed from wire and information she'd extracted from a pamphlet on small game that she'd taken from the home's discard pile 2 years before, the kind of long-term thinking that had seemed like foolishness at the time and now seemed like the most intelligent thing she'd ever done. She learned what genuine hunger felt like, not the skipped meal kind, but the chronic kind, the kind that stopped being a feeling and became a condition, a weight behind the eyes, a fog that made every decision slower and more expensive. She understood for the first time why the Kurtz family had been so insistent that books made girls ungrateful. A girl who could read about other possibilities was a girl who understood she was being given the minimum, and a girl who understood that was a girl who might eventually decide not to accept it. She had accepted a great deal. She was done accepting things. There were nights when the cold went deep enough that she thought about the walk back to the home. 12 miles of road in January. She could make it. She had made worse. Mrs. Stoll would not welcome her, but the institution had beds and heat and 3 meals a day, and the only thing it would cost her was everything she had decided when she walked out of it. On the worst nights, the cost seemed negotiable. What stopped her was not courage. Courage was a word for decisions made in a moment of high feeling, And what she was doing was something steadier and less interesting than that. What stopped her was the 11th ledger. For whoever comes. She read it on the bad nights by lamplight, rationing the oil to 1 hour per evening, and lying in the dark after it was gone, replaying what she'd read. Harriet Winter of 1892. I am not sure I can do another year of this. I am tired of being cold and being mocked for trying not to be cold. Harriet had stood exactly here in this cold, in this particular exhaustion, had written that sentence in this room probably by the same stove, listening to the same wind in the same wall gaps, and had the next day gotten up and gone back to the measuring. Not because she knew it would work, because she was not finished. The understanding of what Harriet had been doing came to Clara May gradually over those months, in the same incremental way that the cold itself arrived, accumulating rather than announcing. It was in February, during a brief thaw that softened the ground enough that she could get water from the well again, and the temperature rose to the 20s, which felt almost warm, that she found the passage in the Warm Corners ledger she had somehow missed on her first reading. Harriet had written about what she called dead air, the phenomenon of stacked bales creating pockets of stillness where the wind could not reach. She had measured the temperature inside a tight bale stack configuration versus the temperature in open ground and found a difference of nearly 20 degrees on the worst days. The straw is not insulation in the way a wall is insulation. It is a break. It slows the wind enough that heat can survive. Not much heat, but enough. Enough is all we need. Clara May read that word 3 times. Enough. Not warmth, not comfort, not the kind of safety she'd read about in other people's lives, the kind that involved fireplaces and thick walls and food stored in actual quantities. Just enough to keep a body alive between points that needed to be reached. She set the ledger on the shelf beside the cracked mason jars and looked out the burlap-covered window at the 50 feet between her kitchen door and the barn door, and something reorganized in her understanding of the problem she was facing. Harriet had spent 28 years trying to solve this exact equation, the equation of the 50 feet, and had come closer than anyone, but had died before finishing. Had left behind 11 ledgers worth of data and a note with Clara May's name on it. Come find my notebooks if I am not here. She was here. The notebooks were here, and when the snow melted and the ground let her move again, she was going to build what Harriet had been building. She was going to close those 50 feet. She didn't know yet whether she could do it. She didn't know yet about Walter Briggs or Roy Callum or what winter of 1914 would ask of everything she built. She didn't know about Dorothy Hale or the pamphlet or the letter that Mrs. Stoll had burned. She didn't know that the barometer with the cracked face would become her most important tool, that she would stand at the kitchen wall and watch its needle drop and understand in her body what the number meant before her mind could articulate it. She knew only that someone like her had come before her, had stood where she was standing and seen what she was beginning to see and been dismissed for it. And that woman had kept measuring year after year, cold year after cold year, building and rebuilding and recording the results until the record was thorough enough to hand to whoever came next. Clara May was 16 years old, and she was holding that record in her hands. She turned back to the beginning of the passage's ledger and started again from the first entry, this time with a piece of charcoal she'd salvaged from the coal stove and a piece of brown paper she'd torn from the back of a farm bulletin, writing down the numbers she needed to remember. The specific dimensions, the bale configurations that had held versus the ones that had failed, the orientation that allowed wind to run over and around instead of through, the distances that needed closing, and the distances that could wait. Outside, the February thaw was already reversing. She could hear the temperature dropping in the sound. The wind made the quality of it changing from a push to something with an edge. By morning, the ground would be frozen again, and the well would be uncertain, and the 50 feet between the two buildings would go back to being what it had been all winter, a distance that looked like nothing, and was actually the most important problem she had ever been handed. She wrote down the numbers. She folded the brown paper and put it in the charcoal smudge pocket of her dress. She added the last piece of wood to the stove and pulled the cot closer to the heat and lay down with the For Whoever Comes ledger open against her chest. The first problem of spring would be materials. 37 bales at a minimum, Harriet's numbers suggested, and that was for the 50 feet alone, 2 walls and a roof frame. Bales she'd have to produce herself because she couldn't afford to buy them, which meant access to a baler, which meant someone willing to trade the use of one for something she had, which was time and the ability to sew, and the particular willingness to work that develops in people who understand that the alternative to work is cold. She could do this, not easily, not without more failures than she wanted to count. But the failures were in the ledgers too cataloged and analyzed and learned from every collapsed wall and torn canvas and drifted shut entrance accounted for in Harriet's careful brown ink. Clara May had the map of what didn't work, which was half the distance to knowing what did. She fell asleep with the wind in the walls and the charcoal numbers in her pocket, and the understanding settled into her like a foundation being poured, that she was not alone in this in any way that ultimately mattered. Harriet Crane was in those 11 ledgers. Harriet was in the measurements on the brown paper. Harriet was in every notation about bale orientation and stake angle and canvas tie-down that Clara May would follow in the coming months, making her hands learn what Harriet's hands had known. The spring would come. It always came. And when it did, Clara May Whitfield was going to take the 50-foot grave that 2 generations of Kearney County men had been using as a punchline and turn it into an answer. Not a simple answer, not a quick one. The wind that had been testing this land for 30 years before she arrived and would be testing it 30 years after she was gone was not a problem with a single solution. It was a problem with a process. Measure, build, fail, measure. Again, build better. She was ready to begin. Spring came to the sandhills the way hard things end, not gradually, but in a single decisive shift. One week the ground was sealed and the sky was the particular white that meant more snow was a question of when rather than whether. The next water was moving everywhere, running in shallow braids across the lane, pooling in the low spots east of the barn, and the air carried something Clara May hadn't smelled in months, the green raw scent of grass resuming its argument with the sky. She had survived the winter. That was the whole of the achievement, stated plainly. She was thinner than she'd been in October, and her hands had developed a geography of small scars from wire and split wood, and the repeated cold that cracked skin at the knuckles regardless of how carefully she rationed the lanolin she'd gotten from Agnes Pruitt in exchange for hemming 3 pairs of her son's trousers. She had used the last of her $4 in February on lamp oil and a small sack of cornmeal. She had no cattle, no horse, no accumulation of anything except knowledge, and the 11 ledgers and the measurements she'd written on brown paper and memorized and could now recite in the dark. Agnes Pruitt lived 5 miles east and had 3 sons who treated their clothing as a form of protest against the idea of fabric. She was a practical woman in the way that ranch wives in that country tended to be practical, not as a personality trait, but as a survival methodology. And she had assessed Clara May on first meeting with the direct efficiency of someone evaluating livestock for winter readiness. What she found apparently passed some internal standard because the arrangement became a regular one. Clara May walked the 5 miles twice a week, mended whatever the boys had destroyed, and came back with eggs and milk and occasionally preserved vegetables from Agnes's root cellar, which was better stocked than anything Clara May could have imagined building in a single season. She gained back 7 of the 15 pounds by mid-April. Her dresses still didn't fit correctly, but the fog behind her eyes cleared, and her hands stopped shaking in the mornings, and she could walk the 5 miles to the Pruitt place and the 5 miles back without sitting down to rest, which had not been true in February. The preparation happened in parallel with the recovery, the way all necessary things happen in that country simultaneously and without adequate time for either. She walked the 50 feet between the shack and the barn with different intentionality, now not as transit but as study. She paced it in different weather morning and afternoon with and without wind, and she stood at different points along the route and tried to understand the geometry of exposure, the way Harriet's ledgers had taught her to think about it, not as a single distance, but as a series of surfaces, each one with its own relationship to the prevailing northwest wind. The lane ran north to south, the barn at the north end. When the wind came from the northwest in winter, which it did with the reliability of something that had found a route it preferred and saw no reason to vary it, it struck the lane at an angle that maximized exposure on both sides and left nothing overhead to interrupt the trajectory of either the wind or the snow it carried. A body walking the lane in those conditions was a body walking through open air in every meaningful direction. Harriet had written about this in the Wind Ledger in an entry from 1886. The passage must address exposure from the sides and from above simultaneously, A wall alone is incomplete. A roof alone is useless. The corridor must close the space in Berkeley, or it does not close it. Clara May had 37 bales to produce before she could start building. 37 was the minimum Harriet's calculations suggested for the primary passage, both walls plus the material for the roof frame. She had no baler. She had no spare money to rent one, and no credit with anyone in Forked Wells who might have offered access on faith. What she had was time and the ability to sew, and she walked the 12 miles into town in early May to negotiate. Forked Wells was a town that knew what it was and had no ambitions toward being anything else. Main Street Church at one end, livery at the other, and between them the institutions that sustained the surrounding ranch economy. The feed store was her first stop because she needed to understand the material costs even when she couldn't afford them, the same way she'd once read seed catalogs, not because she had seeds, but because information about what things should cost was its own form of resource. Garrett Finch ran the feed store with the unhurried authority of a man who understood that in a 12-mile radius, he was the only option. He was heavy-set and bearded, and he looked at Clara May the way people in that country often looked at her, with an evaluation happening behind the eyes that she had learned not to wait for and not to argue with. His first question was whether she was the girl who had taken Harriet Crane's place, and when she confirmed it, his second was a half-suppressed sound that communicated an opinion without technically expressing one. Clara May held her ground on the feed store floor and explained what she needed: the use of a mechanical baler, hand-operated, for the season. She explained what she was offering: mending work, field labor, whatever arrangement made the mathematics work for whoever owned the machine. Garrett told her he didn't own the baler, a neighbor named Coleman did, but that he'd passed the word, and he said it in the tone of a man doing a favor he didn't entirely believe in. He also told her, without being asked, that Harriet Crane had bought more bale twine than any three ranchers combined in her years as a customer. He said she used to joke she was building houses for mice. Then he said what Clara May had already anticipated, that Harriet had died alone in a cold kitchen after 3 days trapped by snow, and that whatever she'd built in those years hadn't saved her in the end. The difference is that she survived the storm. Clara May kept her voice level because she'd learned that the only way to be heard in a room where people have already made up their minds is to speak in a register that doesn't confirm their narrative about you. She died of pneumonia 3 days after the weather broke, when she was old and sick and alone, and her body couldn't fight two things at once. That is not the same as freezing on the walk to the barn, and I will not let anyone tell me it is. Garrett Finch looked at her for a long time. He didn't offer any rejoinder. He also didn't change his expression. She bought what she could with the eggs she'd brought as trade, a small coil of wire and a handful of nails she'd need for the passage frame, and she walked 12 miles home in the May afternoon with the wire coiled over one shoulder and the understanding that the conversation was finished and the work was not. The baler she got through Coleman, directly a farming family 10 miles northwest, whose wife Margaret had heard about the passage project from Agnes Pruitt and thought it was sensible. Clara May walked to the Coleman farm, arranged the terms, which involved 3 weeks of mending Margaret's household linen in exchange for the season's access, and walked back. The work of baling began in late May and extended through June. It was the most physically demanding thing she had done, and she had done things she would not have believed possible before the previous winter. The hand baler compressed loose hay into dense rectangular blocks and tied them with wire, and each block weighed approximately 40 pounds when properly packed. The compression required sustained force and a specific rhythm, and the machine had opinions about both that it communicated through the resistance of the lever arm, which rewarded correct technique, and punished impatience with the unambiguous feedback of a mechanism that didn't care about your reasons. By the end of June, her shoulders sent a specific protest up into her neck every morning when she woke. The calluses on her palms had developed calluses of their own. Her grip, which had never been weak, had become something she noticed when she needed it for other purposes, when she picked up the ledgers or held a needle for mending. The force calibrated now to something heavier than those objects required. She had 37 bales stacked behind the barn, each one dense enough to support her weight without compressing, which was Harriet's test for a properly packed bale and the standard Clara May had adopted as her own. She began building on the 1st of July. The cedar stakes went into the lane first, marking the corridor walls exactly as Harriet's sketch had specified: 6 feet wide, 50 feet long. The bottom row of bales went down with the straightforward confidence of a person who has read about the process extensively and hasn't yet discovered what the reading doesn't cover. The second row required lifting each bale to waist height and setting it in position without dropping it, and without drifting the stack, which required more coordination than the first row, because the surface underneath was now bales rather than ground, and bales had a different relationship with gravity. By the third row, she had constructed a ramp from a salvaged plank and was rolling the bales up rather than lifting them, which was slower but sustainable. On the third day, the east wall fell over. She heard it before she saw it, a settling sound that became a creak, that became the specific grinding of stacked objects finding a lower energy state. She turned from the west wall in time to see the east wall lean pause in the way of something that hasn't committed yet, and then commit. 24 bales came down in a sequence that was almost organized, each row following the one above it, until the whole structure was horizontal, and the lane was blocked, and the afternoon wind moved through the space where the wall had been without noticing it was gone. Clara May stood in the lane and looked at it. The bales had been stacked with their wire ties running perpendicular to the wall's length crosswise, which meant the courses had been sliding against each other along the smooth, compressed hay surfaces rather than interlocking, and the first real lateral force had resolved the structural argument decisively in favor of gravity. She knew this in the first 30 seconds. She also knew that she had enough bales to rebuild the wall correctly because she'd accounted for some loss in her estimates. She knew that the fix was to rotate every bale 90 degrees, so the wire ties ran parallel to the wall's length, allowing the stakes to pin through the tie loops and lock the courses together. She knew all of this clearly and analytically, and without any confusion about what needed to happen. She sat down on an overturned bale and cried for 20 minutes with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been operating at the outer edge of their physical and emotional reserves for 9 months and has just had 24 of those reserves knocked flat by a gust of wind. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve and began restacking. She was on her knees working out the stake angle that would catch the wire loops without splitting the compressed hay when a voice came from the direction of the lane entrance. "You've got the ties running crossways. They'll never hold with the stakes set like that." Walter Briggs was 70 years old by his own approximate accounting and looked like someone had assembled him from the materials available in a place where nothing was wasted and everything earned its keep. His face had been worked by weather into a permanent map of the decisions it had recorded. His hands resting on the saddle horn of a roan mare who was also elderly and also entirely unimpressed by the situation were the hands of a man who had built things for 50 years, thick-knuckled and scarred, in the specific patterns that come from a lifetime of tools and wire and wood that pushed back. Clara May looked at him and then at the fallen wall, and then back at him because his assessment was accurate, and she had no patience for false modesty when someone was right about something. She knew. She was working out the correction when he arrived. He told her his name and that he had known Harriet Crane had fixed her ridgepole in 1896 and sat in her kitchen afterward playing checkers while she talked about wind. He swung down from the mare with the careful deliberateness of a body that had developed a formal relationship with its own limitations, and he walked to the fallen wall and looked at it the way he might look at a problem he'd seen before in different forms. Clara May walked behind it into the sheltered space, and the evening wind that had been a steady presence all day against her face became a sound she could hear but not feel. "It's working." The words came out before she decided to say them. Walter's correction was immediate and dry. That standing. Working is when you walk through it in January and your lantern doesn't blow out. He was right. She knew it. But standing behind that wall in the lee of something she had built with her hands and a dead woman's numbers, she felt for the first time since October. Something that wasn't just the absence of fear. It was the preliminary edge of certainty, the sense that the equation had a solution and that the solution was within reach. Walter came back the next day and the day after that. They built the second wall. They laid salvage planks across the top of both walls anchored with wire ties to the bale stakes and draped canvas over the planks, pinning it at the edges with more stakes driven at angles to prevent the wind from finding a grip. The canvas was old and had been used for other purposes before this one, but it was intact, and it covered the corridor roof from end to end, creating an enclosed space that was 6 feet wide, just tall enough to walk upright and 50 feet long. Clara May waited for the first cool night of September. She stood at her kitchen door with the lantern lit, watching the flames stand perfectly straight in the still indoor air, and then she opened the door and stepped into the corridor. The flame didn't move. Outside the corridor walls, she could hear the grass moving in the wind, the dry, late summer sound of it, the same sound that had been a constant background to every moment she'd spent on this property since the day she arrived. Inside the corridor, the air was still as water in a bowl. She walked the full length without hurrying, watching the flame, and at the halfway point, she stopped and pulled off her right glove and held her bare hand up and turned it slowly. Nothing. No movement of air, no cold current finding the gaps. The temperature inside the corridor was not warm, not heated in any active sense, but it was the ambient temperature of an enclosed space rather than the aggressive temperature of open ground in a September night wind. The difference by Harriet's estimates would grow considerably once January arrived. She stood in the dark in her tunnel, made of straw and canvas and salvage lumber, and she laughed, and Walter found her there still laughing with tears running down her face, and she told him it worked. And he told her it was standing, and she told him she understood the distinction, and for a moment both of them were quiet in the specific way of people who have done something that matters and are being careful with it. Walter told her the real test was January. He said this with the gravity of a man speaking about something he had personal reasons to respect, and that gravity was the opening point to ask why he kept coming out to help a girl he hadn't known a month ago working on a project the county consensus found amusing. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he had decided not to answer. They were sitting on overturned buckets outside the barn with a shared water dipper and the last of the afternoon light going warm across the grass. I had a boy once, 12 years old, winter of '88. He said the rest of it in the same level tone, the way you speak about facts that you have carried long enough that they have worn smooth, the rough edges gone, the weight the same. His son had gone to bring in 2 calves that had wandered when the blizzard hit. He was 50 yards from the barn door. Walter found him the next morning walking the wrong direction, 30 feet from the house, the whiteout having taken his bearings entirely. He had been going away from shelter. He died that distance from warmth. It's not the cold that kills you out here, Walter continued. It's the distance. It's the space between where you are and where you need to be. Close that distance. Make it safe to cross and you change everything. He looked at her directly then. I couldn't save my boy, but maybe I can help you save somebody else's. Clara May didn't ask him why he came after that. She already knew. The autumn Walter spent teaching her things the ledgers couldn't contain. How to read a bale's compression by the sound it made when you tapped it. A properly packed bale had a voice like a drum, a loose one like a mattress. How to set a stake so it bit into the wire loop rather than sliding past it, the angle being the variable and the angle being everything. How to lap the canvas so rain and snowmelt ran off rather than pooling and freezing and expanding and tearing. He came mornings never past midday because his lungs had developed a problem with the cold afternoon air, and in those hours he transferred 50 years of building knowledge into her hands. Your aunt understood the theory, he told her one morning, watching her set a bale with the new precision she'd developed. She could measure anything, but she never had a carpenter's hands. She knew what needed building. She didn't always know how to make it stay built. The first winter the passage was complete, it survived, not without damage. December brought 2 stretches of sustained high wind that tore loose sections of canvas she had to repair on her knees in the snow, her hands so cold the wire was more felt than seen. One section of the west wall began a slow lean that she and Walter corrected during a January thaw, resetting the outer stakes and adding diagonal wire bracing that Walter called a cross brace, and that functioned by converting lateral force into tension distributed across the whole wall rather than concentrated at the base. In March, the snowmelt revealed rot in 3 bottom course bales on the east wall, wood damp damage from groundwater that she hadn't accounted for, and she spent a cold week replacing them before the rot could compromise the courses above. But she had walked those 50 feet every day of that winter, twice a day at minimum, with her lantern in the dark in winds that she measured against Harriet's scale and noted in her own ledger. The flame had never blown out. The second summer she produced 72 bales. The arithmetic of her muscle had changed by then, the work no longer costing the same amounts. It had, the first summer, the body having made its adaptations. She built a second passage from the barn's north entrance to the calf pen 30 feet using what she'd learned about orientation and stake depth and canvas overlap. She built an insulated corner in the barn's southeast interior using bale walls on two sides and the existing barn walls on the other two, creating an enclosed space where milk buckets could sit without the contents freezing in the time so between milking and carrying them to the house. She built what Harriet had called a shelter court on the barn's south-facing exterior, a three-walled bale enclosure open to the south where cattle could stand during the worst wind days, with two sides and a back between them and the northwest. She tracked everything in a new ledger she had bought in Forked Wells, the first purchase she made with cash she had earned rather than traded for. The insulated milk corner stayed 23 degrees warmer than the open barn floor on nights with sustained northwest wind. The shelter court reduced measured wind speed inside it to roughly a quarter of the open ground speed. The calf pen passage allowed her to check newborns in January weather without the frostbite exposure that had cost her two calves the previous winter. Forked Wells still thought she was building houses for mice. She knew this because Garrett Finch said it out loud in his feed store in September, with 3 ranchers present and his voice at a volume designed to carry. She was there buying twine for the new canvas tie-downs she'd designed based on a modification of Harriet's original method, a modification that created a secondary fastening point 6 inches from the primary so that if one failed under wind load, the other held. A passage system she told Garrett, keeping the exact register she'd used in May, the one that didn't confirm the narrative, for winter chores. Garrett drew the 2 words out like he was tasting them for something wrong. She picked up her twine and set her coins on the counter and told him that the difference between surviving a storm and dying in a kitchen 3 days later was not a trivial distinction, and that she intended to spend considerable effort on it, and that she hoped he never had to learn the hard way why it mattered. She walked out. Behind her, one of the ranchers said something to Garrett at a volume she couldn't catch, and she heard Garrett's laugh and she didn't look back. But through the store window, she could see as she passed that one of the 3 men was watching her go with an expression that wasn't quite mockery. His name was Samuel Pruitt, and she would not know it for another year. Roy Callum came in late October when she was in the middle of resetting the West Wall stakes for winter. He was a man who wore expensive clothing for a ranch context, which was a form of communication, and who sat his horse with the easy authority of someone who had never had to wonder whether his weight was welcome. He wanted the land. He had wanted it when Harriet owned it, had offered $18 for it twice, and been refused twice. And he had a straightforward theory about women alone on difficult properties, which was that time and weather would eventually produce the negotiating conditions he preferred. He offered $50, cash. Clara May understood immediately that this was not a price based on the land's value. It was a price based on his estimate of her endurance. She said no. He told her the passage system was a fire risk, which was the kind of warning that meant something else entirely when it came from a man who wanted your property. She said she was careful with fire. He said careful didn't stop accidents. His smile stayed in place throughout the conversation, with the fixed quality of something that had been positioned there before he arrived and would leave with him unchanged. First big blow, he said, and that whole thing goes to Kansas. He turned his horse and rode off, and his 2 hands followed one of them, looking back at her over his shoulder with an expression she cataloged and stored. Roy Callum was not a man who made idle observations. The fire comment was a flag planted in the ground of what he was willing to consider. She told Walter about the visit the next morning. He listened without interrupting. He said Roy Callum had been buying up Sandhills property for 15 years, using methods that started with lowball offers and escalated through legal pressure, water rights disputes, boundary challenges, whatever found purchase. He said Harriet had turned him down twice, and that Roy had expected the third attempt to be different because he'd expected Harriet to die before the second winter. She hasn't? Clara May said. Walter's expression held something she couldn't immediately name, and then it was the specific satisfaction of a man watching something he helped build continue to stand. She hasn't. Agnes Pruitt walked through the completed passage in November and held out her bare hand at the midpoint and said she could hear the wind, but she couldn't feel it. Clara May built Agnes a passage that month, 40 feet from farmhouse to stock shed, taking payment in preserved meat and lamp oil and the loan of the Pruitt's spare wagon. Agnes told her husband, and Agnes's husband told his brother, Samuel, and Samuel Pruitt came by the following spring asking about wire and stayed 3 hours helping set the South Shelter Court's replacement bales. Clara May noticed that he listened more than he talked and that he did not smile at the measuring she did while they worked, not with amusement, not with tolerance, just with the straight attention of someone for whom another person measuring things was a normal and unremarkable activity. Dorothy Hale arrived that spring with a notebook and a sharp pencil and the teacher's particular kind of attention that doesn't let details slide past unexamined. She had heard about Clara May from Agnes Pruitt. She spent 4 hours going through Harriet's ledgers and 2 hours going through Clara May's own records, and then sat down on the overturned bucket outside the barn and said, "This is 28 years of systematic field observation. Your aunt was conducting science before most people in this county knew what science was. She was trying not to freeze to death." Dorothy's pencil didn't stop moving. Same thing. She wanted to write a pamphlet, plain language, clear diagrams, the kind of construction guide a woman with no carpentry background could follow. She wanted to send it to the county extension and to ranch wives across the region and to the agricultural office in Lincoln. Clara May said yes because the alternative was watching what Harriet had spent 30 years developing stay in a locked chest in a shack that the next hard winter might take down entirely. The pamphlet came together through late spring. Dorothy drafted, Clara May corrected the technical sections, and the result was 17 pages of the most practical document Clara May had ever read that she hadn't written herself. It went out in late June. Dorothy came back in August with a different expression, something underneath the usual forward-facing attention, and Clara May recognized the specific quality of news that a person is deciding how to say. Dorothy had been researching in the county records for context to include in a follow-up document about land use and weather patterns. In the land office section, she had found a recently filed water rights petition from Roy Callum requesting right of access to install drainage infrastructure based on a survey showing a seasonal water channel running through the northern corner of Half Sky Draw. The channel was a snowmelt feature, intermittent and shallow, that Harriet had documented in the January notes ledger as appearing for approximately 6 weeks in early spring and drying completely by May. It was not a water source in any practical sense, but the petition used it to claim that Roy's downstream pasture required access to manage the flow. Dorothy explained what access meant in this context, the way Roy had used similar petitions twice before to establish legal presence on properties he subsequently acquired. Once you had documented right of access, you had the basis for easement disputes. Once you had easement disputes, you had leverage. Once you had leverage, the mathematics of a woman alone on a difficult property changed in ways that eventually produced the negotiating conditions Roy preferred. There was a 60-day window to file a counter petition. Clara May had 51 days left. She had no money for a lawyer. Dorothy had time and a good pencil, and it turned out a precise understanding of Nebraska land law from a course she'd taken at the Kearney Teachers College. They wrote the counter petition at the kitchen table over 3 evenings, citing 30 years of Harriet's documentation showing the channel as seasonal snowmelt, only non-navigable, non-continuous, and supporting no downstream irrigation claim. They attached dates and measurements in the specific entries from the January notes in snow ledgers that established the pattern beyond reasonable dispute. Clara May filed it at the Forked Wells Land Office with 8 days to spare. 3 weeks later, Roy Callum withdrew his petition. No statement, no explanation noted in the public record. Dorothy told Clara May that men like Roy didn't give reasons when they retreated because giving reasons acknowledged that a retreat had occurred. "He'll try something else," Clara May said. Dorothy's answer was the truest thing anyone had said to her since Walter's lesson about stake angles. The fact that he keeps trying means you're worth trying against. That's not nothing. October arrived, and with it the third autumn of her tenure on Half Sky Draw, and the routine of pre-winter preparation had by now the quality of a known language, the body performing it without the translation delay of conscious direction. She checked every stake in every passage. She replaced damaged canvas sections before they became failures. She laid in 70 pounds of dried beans and 20 pounds of cornmeal, and a quantity of root vegetables from the garden she'd finally established in the second summer's soil preparation. She had 6 cattle now, a milk cow who had been producing steadily for 2 seasons, and 12 chickens that Walter had given her. Walter came less often by October. His coughing had worsened since the previous spring in a way that had progressed from a problem to a condition to something she recognized as a direction. He still came mornings when the weather allowed, and when he came, he sat on the hay bale he designated as his working position and directed her with the compact precision of 50 years of knowledge being transferred in whatever time remained for the transfer. She lifted what needed lifting. She carried what needed carrying. She did not acknowledge what the handkerchief meant when he used it and looked away. The barometer Harriet had left in the chest hung on the kitchen wall, now cleaned and tested and calibrated against Dorothy's own instrument, which she'd brought for comparison. Clara May checked it every morning with the automatic attention she gave the lamp oil level and the water bucket situation. The needle had developed a relationship with her intuition, its small arcs communicating information that she processed before she consciously interpreted it. On the 12th of January, in the year that would be the year the needle dropped 8 points overnight. On the 13th, it was still dropping. The sky was clear and pale, and the air had the specific false warmth of a pressure system that has not yet revealed its intentions. Every animal on the property was behaving as though something they couldn't see was already present. The milk cow had pressed herself into the insulated corner without being driven there. The cattle stood in the shelter court with their tails to the northwest and didn't move to graze. Walter came that afternoon moving slowly, his breath short from the ride, and he stood in the kitchen and looked at the barometer, and his face arranged itself into the expression of a man recognizing something he has been expecting for a long time. He coughed into his handkerchief, and she looked at the window. Get the hay in. He didn't say it urgently because urgency wasn't available to him anymore, but the weight behind the words was unambiguous. Fill every container with water. Check every anchor point in every passage. Check every stake in every canvas tie. You have maybe 24 hours. She asked whether it was as bad as she thought, and he said it was worse. And then he said the thing that settled into her like ballast. This feels like 88. That same stillness before the door opens. He left before dark to make it back before the temperature dropped further, and Clara May worked through the night. She hauled hay into the barn until she had 3 days' feed stacked against the north wall. She filled every bucket, every pot, every vessel she owned with water. She walked every passage with a lantern, testing every stake by pushing against the wall surface with both hands, adding wire bracing at 2 points on the west quarter that moved more than she was comfortable with, replacing a canvas tie-down on the north end of the calf pen passage where the original knot had loosened over the autumn. At 2 in the morning, she was standing in the primary corridor with the lantern, the one Harriet had planned and she had built and rebuilt and corrected and reinforced across 3 years and 2 winters. The flame stood absolutely straight in the still air. Outside the corridor walls, the prairie was silent in the specific way of the hour before something enormous arrives, the absence of even the small sounds that usually inhabited the dark. She set her palm flat against the east wall and felt the dense solid press of packed hay, thousands of pounds of it, each bale locked to its neighbor, by stakes and by tays running the right direction, each course angled slightly inward against the anticipated push, the whole structure leaning into the coming force the way Walter had shown her. She thought about Harriet's numbers in Walter's hands and the 11 ledgers and the note with her name on it, and she thought about the 50 feet behind her and the 50 feet ahead of her in the corridor that connected them. She had done everything she could do. The rest was January's answer. She went inside and lay down fully dressed and listened to the silence and did not sleep. The storm arrived the way Walter had described it, not as weather building toward itself, but as a wall that had already decided what it was before it reached her. Clara May was in the barn at first light, running through the final morning check, when the sound reached her. Not wind yet, not the whistle and gust she knew from 3 winters on this land, but something below sound, a pressure change she felt first in her ears and then in her sternum, the specific physical sensation of the atmosphere compressing before it released. She stepped outside the barn's south door and looked north, and what she saw stopped her the way very few things had stopped her in her life. The sky was gone, not overcast, not darkened, gone, replaced from the ground up by a black, rolling mass that moved toward her with the purposeful speed of something that had been building across hundreds of miles of open country and had finally arrived at the place it intended to be. The line where normal sky ended and the storm began was as sharp as a cut, and it was close, and it was moving at a speed that compressed the available time from minutes to something less. She ran for the house through the primary corridor, and the canvas above her was already beginning to strain against its tie-downs when she pushed through the kitchen door and pulled it shut behind her. The latch had barely engaged when the wind hit the structure. The sound was not like any other wind she had cataloged in her ledgers. It was not a sustained note or a series of gusts with intervals between them. It was continuous, in total, a sound that occupied every frequency simultaneously, and under it was the structural response of the shacking, the board speaking back in the only language they had, the protest of assembled materials being asked to bear more than they were designed to bear. The windows held, the door held. The stovepipe, which she had braced with additional wire the previous night, held. The temperature drop came so fast that she could track it on Harriet's barometer and on her own skin, 40 degrees of change in 3 hours, the kitchen going from the mild cold of an unheated room to something she had to address with the stove or risk the water in the buckets icing over. She fed the stove and sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in the 4.5 years she had been on this land, she did not know what was happening to the corridor she had built. She could hear the wind above it, the sound of it moving over the structure and around it, and she could hear the canvas working against its fastenings, a rhythmic stress that was at the edge of audible through the shack's north wall. She had tested every anchor point 6 hours ago. She had added bracing at the 2 weak sections. She had done everything Harriet's measurements and Walter's knowledge, and 3 years of her own failures had taught her to do. Now the storm would answer. She waited 2 hours. She made herself wait the full 2 hours because going out before the storm had reached its sustained state would give her information about the passage at the beginning of its test and not at the middle of it, and the middle was what mattered. She tracked the time on the small clock on the shelf, the only piece of furniture she had bought with money rather than found or traded for. At exactly 2 hours, she lit the lantern, put on every layer she owned, pulled her coat over the layers, wrapped her scarf around her head and face until only her eyes were uncovered, and opened the kitchen door. The cold that entered the room in the 2 seconds before she stepped through it was not the cold of winter mornings or January nights or any of the accumulated cold she had learned to work inside. It was the cold of a system that had been building across the northern plains for days and had brought all of that distance with it, and it struck the exposed skin above her scarf like something physical, like a blade with ambitions. She stepped into the corridor. The screaming stopped. Not entirely, not from the world. The storm was still fully present on the other side of the bale walls, still running at whatever speed it had reached in its first sustained hour. But inside the corridor, the sound dropped from the full-body assault of open ground exposure to something she could locate directionally above her and to the sides outside the structure, identifiable as weather, rather than experienced as immersion. The air inside the corridor was cold, genuinely cold, not a shelter from cold, but a shelter from the wind that drove cold into exposed flesh and pulled heat out of a body faster than any still air could. Harriet's entry from 1883 had been exactly right. The straw did not stop cold. It stopped wind, and wind was what killed. The lantern flame stood straight in her hand. She walked. She had walked this corridor more than 300 times by her own count, the daily double transit that she had made a discipline, regardless of weather, regardless of how her body felt about it, because the discipline was the point, because a passage you didn't use in bad weather was a passage you hadn't built. Every one of those 300 walks had been a practice run for this one. She did not hurry. She moved at the same pace she always moved, watching the flame and feeling the dull air against what small portions of her face the scarf didn't cover, listening to the storm doing its work on the outside of everything she had built. The flame did not flicker. She walked to the barn and found the cattle pressed into the shelter court with the density of animals who have found the warmest available configuration and are not interested in moving from it. The milk cow stood in her insulated corner with the calm of a creature whose immediate environment had not meaningfully changed despite the noise surrounding it. The chickens were in their coop alive, moving, not interested in Clara May's presence. She worked through the feeding and the watering with the methodical efficiency of the practice routine, and then she walked back through the corridor to the house and sat down at the kitchen table and put her head in both hands. She was not crying from fear. She was not crying from relief exactly, though relief was present in the physical sensation of her shoulders dropping from the position they had occupied for the past 6 hours. She was crying because the thing that Harriet Crane had spent 28 years trying to prove, the thing that Clara May had spent 4.5 years learning to build properly, had just been tested by the worst system either of them could have anticipated and had performed exactly as the measurements said it should. The numbers had been right all along. They had always been right. They had just needed someone patient enough and stubborn enough to stack the bales the right way and drive the stakes at the right angle and keep coming back after every collapse. The storm ran for 9 days. She made 2 transits every day, morning and evening, on every one of those 9 days. The corridor held. The shelter court held. The milk corner held. She lost no cattle, no chickens, no stored water. The calf pen passage held without requiring any mid-storm repair. The one repair she did make on the 4th day was to a canvas section on the corridor's north end that had developed a small tear at the corner of a tie-down, a tear she felt rather than saw by running her gloved hands along the canvas surface during her morning transit. She repaired it with a patch of spare canvas and copper wire, working in the corridor's still air, with her lantern hanging from a stake, and her breath the only movement in the enclosed space. What was happening 12 miles away in Forked Wells, and 5 miles away at the Pruitt Ranch, and 3 miles away at Walter's Place, she learned afterward. The gathering of those accounts took weeks as people found their way out of their own damage and began the process of comparing what they had survived with what they hadn't. It came to her in pieces the way that kind of news always comes in communities that communicate through proximity and observation rather than formal channels. The Petersons' well froze solid on the 2nd day. Their barn lane was open ground without any windbreak, and the snow drifted across it in the storm's first 12 hours until the drift stood higher than a man's head and removed the walk from consideration entirely. When the wind dropped enough on the 7th day to attempt the crossing, they went through the drift on their hands and knees in relays, and 3 of their 4 calves were dead. One of them still standing frozen in the position it had held when the temperature dropped below the survivable threshold. Old Walt Krebs, who had driven Clara May to the end of the lane on an October morning 4 years ago and turned his wagon around without looking back, went out to his stock on the 4th day because the situation inside his barn had reached a point where he could no longer delay. He lost 2 fingers on his right hand to the crossing and 1 on his left, and he spent the rest of his life doing the arithmetic of whether the 3 fingers were worth the cattle he saved, which was an arithmetic that never came out clean. The Hendricks boy, 14 years old, went missing for an hour and a half during a ground blizzard on the 6th day, a condition where the wind moved the snow along the surface and removed all visual reference without actually adding precipitation, the most disorienting form of winter weather on the open plains. His father found him curled against a fence post, still conscious, still moving 30 feet from the house and walking parallel to it rather than toward it. He kept all his fingers and all his toes, but he walked differently afterward with the careful attention of someone who had learned in his body that ground he knew perfectly well in all other seasons could become unknown territory in a single hour. Roy Callum's barn was 70 feet from his house, and the lumber windbreak he had constructed on the property's north exposure was the kind of structure that looked substantial from a distance and functioned on the assumption that wind was a force you redirected rather than a system you addressed. The wind found the gap between the break's 2 sections on the 3rd day. It didn't push through the gap so much as recognize it as an invitation, and what came through the invitation took the milkroom roof with it and buried the interior in snow that compacted to ice in the overnight temperature drop. Roy's cattle began dying on the 5th day. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough that the count at the end of the storm was a number that changed the mathematics of the coming year for his entire operation. She learned all of this afterward. During the storm, she knew only her own. 50 feet walk twice daily, the flame burning straight, the walls holding the animals alive on the far end. When the wind stopped on the 9th morning, she woke to silence so absolute that she lay still for 30 seconds, listening for the sound that would tell her it had only paused. The clock on the shelf said 4:47. Through the burlap patch window, the sky was a color she had not seen in 9 days, a deep pre-dawn gray that was dark rather than white sky, rather than weather. She got up and went to the door and opened it onto cold, so clean it had its own quality of sound, the absence of the storm's constant noise leaving an acoustic space that felt larger than the actual space it occupied. She dug out the corridor entrance, which had drifted over in the final night's wind, and checked the animals, and then took her shovel and walked 3 miles through snow that came to her hip in the drifted sections and her knee in the open ground, and arrived at Walter's door to find smoke coming from the chimney in a thread so thin she could barely distinguish it from the cold air. He was in his chair by the stove, wrapped in every blanket the house contained, the fire reduced to coals, his breathing the audible labor of a man whose lungs had been fighting a losing argument with the cold for months. He looked at her when she came through the door, and his expression reorganized itself into something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite recognition, but contained both. Clara May. His voice was diminished in a way it hadn't been in October. You made it through. The corridor held. She was already moving to the stove, adding wood from the box beside it, adjusting the damper. Every anchor point. He was quiet while the fire built back. She found food in his root cellar and heated it on the restored stove and brought it to him, and he ate slowly and without much appetite. But he ate. After a while, he said Harriet would have been proud of you, and she had to turn away to do something with the pot on the stove that didn't require turning away, but gave her a reason to. She stayed 2 days. She left him with 3 days of stacked wood and a full water bucket and the fire drawing properly, and she walked back through the snow to half-sky draw and waited to see what came next. Mrs. Edna Stowell came on the 11th day after the storm. Clara May was at the south window when the rented wagon came up the lane, and she did not move from the window immediately. She stood and looked at the figure climbing down from the wagon with the stiff, careful movements of a woman who had ridden 12 miles in post-storm cold and whose body was communicating its objections through every available channel. Mrs. Stowell's face, even at this distance, was different from the face Clara May had last seen in the Platte River girls' home common room. That face had been organized by certainty. This one was organized by something that had replaced the certainty and not yet found its own shape. The knock at the door was smaller than Clara May expected. Not tentative exactly, but without the institutional authority that had characterized every interaction they'd had when Clara May was inside the institution rather than outside it. Mrs. Stowell's voice when she spoke carried the specific effort of a woman who has prepared words and is now discovering that the prepared words are not the ones that will come out the home's cow. The girls have had no fresh milk for 11 days. I was told I heard that you... The sentence stopped because the next word was asking, and asking was a posture Mrs. Stowell had not been required to assume in many years. And the body remembered postures longer than the mind remembered the reasons for them. Clara May stepped back from the doorway and let her in. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Clara May had read Harriet's ledgers by lamplight in her first winter, and she wrapped her hands around the tin cup of coffee with the automatic gratitude of someone who has been cold for a long time and is only now noticing it. She looked around the kitchen, at the barometer on the wall, at the ledgers stacked on the shelf, at the evidence of a life that had been built here rather than survived here. And her expression was that of someone encountering a revision of a story they had considered settled. Clara May told her she could spare milk, that the cow had been producing steadily, that she didn't want payment. Mrs. Stowell asked what she wanted instead, which was the question of a woman who understood that nothing is offered without a cost she hadn't yet identified. Take the milk to the girls. That's all. What happened next was something Clara May had not prepared for and would not have known how to prepare for. Mrs. Stowell's face, the face that had been managing itself so carefully since she arrived, stopped managing. The coffee cup stayed in her hands. She looked at the table's surface. Your aunt wrote to me. Her voice had changed register entirely, something underneath the institutional tone surfacing for the first time. Twice. Once in 1906 and once in 1908. She had heard about you from the traveling minister Whitaker, who came through Forked Wells on his circuit route and stopped at the home. He described you to her, and she wrote to ask whether there was a girl named Clara May Whitfield in my care, whether she was Ruth Crane's daughter, whether she had a home or wanted one. The kitchen was very quiet. I burned both letters. Mrs. Stowell's hands moved slightly on the cup. I thought she was eccentric at best. I had heard the stories about her, the straw structures, the years spent measuring wind on worthless land. I thought that sending a girl from my care to a woman like that on land like this would be the opposite of protecting her. I told myself I was protecting you. Clara May stood at the counter with a distance of 4.5 years behind her and listened to the sentence that changed the shape of all of it. Not the content, not the facts of what had happened, which could not be changed, but the shape. Harriet had known about her, had tried twice, had wanted her here while there was still time to learn from the living version of the knowledge, rather than from the ledgers it had left behind. 2 letters, both burned by a woman acting on a certainty she had not earned. She could have been here at 16 with Harriet still alive. She could have learned the stake angles from the hands that designed them. She could have spent years building with the architect of the system rather than reconstructing it from notes written for whoever came after. All of those winters, all of that hunger, or all of those hours lying on a frozen cot deciding whether to stay, might have been different. Not easy. The land didn't do easy, but not alone in the way she had been alone. What she felt was not the righteous heat she might have expected, not the inventory of grievances that had been accumulating since the day she stood in that common room and heard 19 people laugh. What she felt was a specific grief for Harriet, for the woman who had written twice and waited, and eventually written the note with Clara May's name on it and tucked it into the false bottom of a grain chest because 2 letters hadn't worked and maybe the notebooks would. I forgive you. She said it clearly and without pause because she had arrived at it in the time it took to breathe. Not because you deserve it, because Harriet spent 30 years building something worth hearing, and I will not be the one who buries it twice. Mrs. Stoll did not respond with words. She sat at the table for another minute, and then she stood and wiped her face with a precise, controlled motion and said the wagon was outside and the milk would freeze if they didn't move it along. Clara May went to the barn through the corridor, the still air of the passage unchanged by what had just happened in the kitchen, permanent and functional, regardless of the human weather on either side of it. She filled 2 cans with milk and carried them back. Mrs. Stowell loaded them onto the wagon without help, climbed up to the seat, and drove back down the lane toward the 12 miles of road to Kearney County. She came back the next day with the home's cook, who had specific questions about keeping a cow's milk production stable through sustained cold weather stress. She came back 2 days after that with 2 empty cans and a neighboring farm wife who needed to understand the shelter court design for her own stock. The line that grew from those subsequent visits would eventually reach further than either woman could have predicted, standing at the kitchen door in the aftermath of a 9-day blizzard. But it started with a cook asking practical questions about a milk cow and a woman who had burned 2 letters deciding at whatever cost to her accounting of herself that she was not going to let the third opportunity pass. Roy Callum's hired man arrived on the 14th day after the storm coming up the lane, alone in the wagon without Roy, which told the whole story of why he was there before he said a word. He didn't meet Clara May's eyes when he asked whether she could spare 20 bales for temporary shelter repair. He held his hat and looked at the ground and communicated with every aspect of his posture that this errand had cost his employer something that Roy Callum would rather have paid in any other currency. Walter was at the property that morning, moving carefully, but present, sitting on his designated hay bale and watching Clara May work through the season's first post-storm maintenance check. He looked at the hired man and then at Clara May, and his expression asked a question without requiring it to be spoken. She watched the man standing in the lane with his hat and his averted eyes, and she thought about what Roy had called her corridor on a late October afternoon 2 years ago. An eyesore, a fire pile, the kind of thing that would be in Kansas before the first real blow. She thought about the $50 he had offered her for a piece of land he knew was worth 10 times that, and the fire comment that was a threat wearing the costume of a concern, and the water rights petition that Dorothy had found, and that had required 8 days of kitchen table work to counter. Load them up. She told the man which bales from the south stack were available, and she turned back to her maintenance work. Walter's silence had a quality to it. She felt it on her back before she turned around. He doesn't deserve it. The words were not a challenge. They were an observation offered the way Walter offered most things, directly and without decoration. Clara May set down the wire cutter she'd been using to check the tension on the shelter court's anchor lines. Maybe not. The wind tried to kill all of us the same way. I won't do its work for it. Walter was quiet for a long time. The hired man worked steadily in the background, loading bales with the efficient silence of a man trying to complete an uncomfortable task as quickly as possible. The cold was absolute and dry, the post-storm cold that arrived once the system passed and the temperature settled into the negatives with the permanence of a verdict. Finally, Walter nodded once, a single, deliberate motion. Harriet would have said the same thing he said. Nearly the same words. He died in late February when the worst of the winter had released its grip on the county by exactly enough that the roads were passable and the temperature had risen to the merely bitter rather than the genuinely dangerous. Clara May made the 3-mile walk to his property and found the door unlocked in the way of a house that doesn't need to protect itself from anything anymore. The stove had burned out. The room was cold enough that her breath showed. Walter was in his chair with his boots set neatly beside it and his glasses folded on the small table, and beside the glasses a bowl of mushroom soup that had gone cold without freezing, which told her what she needed to know about when he had stopped needing it. He looked like a man who had sat down to rest for a few minutes and had found in the resting that he had done enough. She sat with him while the light changed in the windows and the cold increased in the room. Not fixing the stove, not moving, just sitting across from the man who had appeared at the end of her lane on a roan mare on the day she most needed someone to appear, who had given her 50 years of building knowledge in exchange for nothing except the chance to finish something Harriet had started and that his boy's absence had made necessary. He had lost a son in the whiteout of 1888 and had spent every year after that looking for the use of what that loss had left him with. He had found it. The corridor still stood. It had just survived the worst test the Nebraska sandhills had offered in a quarter century. He left her the wagon, his tools, and the small acreage with the cottonwood trees that provided what half-sky draw had always lacked, a natural windbreak on the northwest exposure and a year-round water source that didn't freeze to the bottom. She spent the following summer moving her primary operation there. Walter's land, which she continued to call Walter's land long after the deed transferred into her name, had room for more cattle and better drainage, and the cottonwoods that Harriet had noted in the wind ledger as the single thing the original property lacked that could not be built. Half Sky Draw became a winter station, a property she maintained and checked and kept in working order because it was where Harriet's quarter stood, and she was not going to let Harriet's quarter fall into disrepair. She walked the 50 feet on every visit the way she had walked it through that 9-day storm, not because the transit required it, but because the discipline was the point. Samuel Pruitt had been coming around since the spring. He arrived asking about wire. He was a man who had watched Clara May work without offering the particular kind of assistance that is actually instruction, without suggesting she hold the tool differently or brace the stake from another angle or consider approaching the problem from a perspective that happened to be his. He came and he helped and he listened when she talked about the measurements, and he looked at the ledgers when she offered them without the expression of polite tolerance she had learned to identify in the faces of people who thought the measuring was an eccentricity she'd eventually outgrow. He married her in the spring of her 24th year at the county clerk's office in Forked Wells with Agnes and Dorothy as witnesses. They had children. This story is not about the children who had their own stories that belonged to them, rather than to the corridor and the ledgers and the 50 feet. So only this much needs to be said. They grew up knowing that their mother measured things, that the bale walls and the canvas passages and the insulated corners were as much a part of the landscape of their childhood as the cottonwoods in the well and the Nebraska sky that went on past the point where watching it became a kind of falling. They grew up knowing that a woman named Harriet Crane had measured wind for 28 years on land everyone called worthless, and that their mother had continued what Harriet started, and that continuing what someone else started when they couldn't finish it was one of the most serious things a person could do. Dorothy Hale's pamphlet found its way into more hands than either of them had anticipated when they sat at the kitchen table writing it. County agents picked it up. The extension office in Lincoln distributed it in a quarterly mailing to rural households. A man from the university came out in the summer of Clara May's 5th year and spent a week at Walter's land with a notebook measuring the temperature differentials in the insulated structures and asking questions that told her he'd read Harriet's ledgers carefully before arriving. He left with 3 pages of figures and a promise to write something for the agricultural journals, and 2 years later, she saw Harriet Crane's name in print for the first time, cited in a paper about thermal management in ranch outbuildings as a self-trained field observer whose 30 years of systematic data collection constituted one of the earliest and most thorough records of microclimate behavior in the Nebraska sandhills. She built passages until her hands couldn't manage the bale weight anymore, and that took longer than people expected from a woman who had started small and spent decades doing hard physical work. When she could no longer lift, she could still teach, and she stood in the wind beside young women who reminded her of the person she'd been at 16, not because they looked like her or had her history, but because they had the same look in their eyes when they encountered a problem that could be measured, the look of a mind that was already turning the number over finding its implications, working out what it meant about what needed to be done. She showed them what Walter had shown her: ties running lengthwise, stakes at the angle that catches rather than deflects, bottom course wider than the top. Wind wants to push. You lean into it before it can lean into you. The years accumulated the way years do, when you are not spending your primary energy on survival faster than they did in the first winters on Half Sky Draw, when each month had the texture of a year, and each year felt like a decade. Children grew and moved toward their own lives. Samuel died on an October morning, quietly the way he'd done everything in the chair by the east window where he liked to watch the cottonwoods work in the wind. Clara May continued. She was not done measuring. She died on a Tuesday morning in March in the passage at Half Sky Draw. She had gone out to show her grandson, who was 8 years old, and had her eyes and her way of looking at things before touching them, how to tie down canvas correctly. It was a skill that had to be learned in the hands, rather than from a description, the proper tension of the tie, the angle of the secondary fastening that kept the corner from lifting in a gust. She had shown him twice and was showing him a third time when she sat down on the nearest bale, and the morning light in the corridor was the particular pale gold of early spring in Nebraska, and the air was still as it had always been in that space, still in the way of a place that had been designed for stillness and had been maintained in that design through decades of work and repair and replacement. Her daughter said afterward that she looked like she was thinking, like a woman who had sat down to work something out and gotten absorbed in working it out. Her hands in her lap, her eyes open, the expression on her face, the expression of someone who has arrived at an answer and is checking it against the question one more time before being satisfied. The corridor has been rebuilt 3 times since then, not redesigned. Rebuilt using the same specifications that Harriet sketched on brown paper in 1881, and that Clara May corrected based on 3 winters of trial, and that Walter taught her to anchor properly so the wind couldn't find the angles it needed. The families who maintain it now are the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who came to the kitchen door in the 14 days after the January storm of 1914, the ones who came with empty buckets and questions, and the particular expression of people who have been shown that something they believed impossible has been accomplished with hay and wire, and 50 years of women refusing to call a solvable problem unsolvable. In the County Museum at Forked Wells, there is a glass case. It contains a single ledger bound in flour sacking, tied with twine, the label on its cover faded but still legible. It is open to a page near the middle, the ink brown with age, the handwriting small and precise, in the way of someone for whom precision was not a style but a method. The entry is from the winter of 1883, and the sentence the museum card identifies as significant reads, as it has always read, unchanged by the decades of hands that have turned the page it rests on. In these plains, warmth is not made first by fire. It is made by stopping the wind. A woman wrote that sentence alone in a cold shack on a piece of land 12 miles from the nearest town in the second winter of a project everyone around her found absurd. She wrote it because she had the data to support it, because she had been measuring for 2 years, and the measurements said what the measurements said, regardless of what anyone thought about a woman who spent her summers stacking hay in configurations the county found amusing. She wrote it, and she kept writing ledger after ledger year after year in the cold and in the summer heat and in the particular loneliness of a person working on a problem that won't be solved in a single lifetime. A girl found those ledgers on the floor of that shack in October of a hard year, sitting in the cold with numb fingers and $2.50 and the specific form of stubbornness that develops in people who have been told for long enough that their situation is both difficult and entirely their problem to manage. She read the sentence. She understood it not as a metaphor and not as philosophy, but as data, as the result of a measurement made by someone who had been looking at the same problem she was looking at and had refused to conclude that the problem was too small to solve. The distance that everyone tells you is nothing is often the only distance that matters. The 50 feet that looks like a walk and becomes a sentence when the weather turns. Close it. Measure the problem stack. What's available, drive the stake at the angle that holds and close it. Not because the conditions are right. Not because you have enough support from the people around you who have decided what the land is worth before they've looked at it properly. Because the distance is there, and the distance can be measured, and anything that can be measured can be understood, And anything that can be understood can one bale at a time be addressed. The corridor still stands.